You are at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. This event is Occupy and the Future of the American Left. I will start this with a small, slightly irrelevant story to explain some things really quick. So back in the 90s, before there was technology that told you where everything was, I used to get flyers that would tell me where music shows were happening. And that was it. That was the only way you knew something was going on in a city somewhere. And you would hope and pray that on the day that that event happened, that when you showed up there, the event would be going on. More often than not, there was something going on, and it turned out to be interesting, but usually bands you wanted to see had left, or didn't show up, or you got there and the house had been torn down, or something had happened. So I preface it this way to say thank you all for coming. I put out a flyer that said you would be coming to a discussion that did not have anything listed as to what you would be seeing or talking about. So I encourage you to know that this is a participatory discussion. Solon and Rich have kindly agreed to talk for a few minutes about this topic, and then we're going to just open it up and try to have a broader discussion. The other reason I mention this is that the 4 other panelists that were supposed to be here tonight all canceled on me within the span of about 12 hours, from last night at 6 o'clock to early this morning at 8 o'clock. So, again,
Can't make a revolution like that.
we'll see what happens. So the questions I kind of tossed out when we were coming up with the idea to do this, because I have talked to many of you in this room about this topic separately, and there has not yet been a venue here at ESCAR to actually start talking about these ideas in a more public forum since they have occurred. And so the questions I lodged at Rich and Solon was really, what does Occupy mean in the context of going into an election year in the United States where, in 2010 all we heard about was the Tea Party and how the Tea Party changed politics in the United States. And to some extent people could argue, yes, it's totally incapacitated government. Is Occupy going to do the same thing? And, I don't think anybody has the answers. I think we're all just fascinated by the fact that this movement is gaining ground. It's not going away. It is relevant, more relevant than ever, and it's an interesting time to be in the United States. And I think it's an interesting time to be alive in the world, but particularly coming into the spring of next year, it will be a very interesting time to be here. And with that, I guess I'm going to turn it over to Rich, since he has kindly volunteered to go first. Richard Rubenstein and Solon Simmons are both professors here at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So I'm excited to hear their expertise.
Thank you. I'm not sure expertise is relevant here, and sometimes I wonder how relevant experience is. I'm going to talk very briefly about that because my experience in movements of mass protesters in the 60s and 70s, when I was in Chicago and involved in anti-war and social justice work, Black Power work and social justice work in Chicago. And I have to say, I think to begin with that I feel the two have kind of hesitancies about talking about the subject. One hesitancy has to do with simply with its complexity. And the fact that I think it helps to be a little bit wary, a little bit tentative about describing events that are this unusual, this potentially important, this exciting, at least to many of us, and recognizing that there are contingencies in history. There are things that don't turn out the way you think they're going to. Either they turn out a lot better or a lot worse. And also that there are contingencies in the sense that events shape movements. One event already Michael has mentioned is the coming presidential election. And I'm sure we'll be talking about what the interrelationship may be between these events and the election. The other source for my hesitancy has to do with my experience. I went back and looked at some of my old files. I'm in fact writing a book about my 60s and 70s experiences and what they might mean for current events. And I found an article of mine dated April something 1973 that ran in the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper. The headline was, "The fuse of revolution is already lit." A lot of us in those days thought that the kind of movement that we were participating in would become more and more significant, would become national, would survive the end of the Vietnam War, even though we saw the end of the Vietnam War coming. And the article basically said, when people's basic needs are not being met, when people understand, as they are understanding all throughout America, that the system is rigged in favor of the wealthy, the powerful, and the prestigious against everybody who's not either wealthy, powerful, or prestigious. We did not use 1% and 99%, and in fact, I'm not even sure that's an accurate way of dividing the population, but we certainly were talking about a kind of injustice which seemed obvious, of which people seemed quite conscious. And in fact, people were quite conscious. You know, even the Nixon administration was passing social welfare legislation and talking about guaranteed annual incomes, if you could believe that, in 1972 and 1973. And so it didn't work out quite the way we thought it was going to work out. Posing two fascinating questions. And the third reason for my hesitancy is simply because of things that we don't understand very well yet. We really do not understand very well how mass movements work. Thanks to Charles Tilly and some other scholars, we know more than we did before he did his work. But we still really are, to some extent, mystified by the beginning of the movement, its dynamics, and its potential outcomes. Why, in the summer of, last summer, to personalize this a little bit, I'm doing my email. And on the email, I get a notice from, I don't even know how I got it, from people who are calling themselves the October Mobilization, announcing that beginning in October 5th, 2011, there would be a mobilization. They didn't use the word Occupy because Occupy Wall Street hadn't happened yet. There would be a mobilization in Washington, D.C. They would be focused on Freedom Plaza. McPherson Square then took place also, but that was a little bit later. Actually, they arrived earlier, but the announcement was later. And they suggested that the point of this mobilization would be to call attention to the increasing inequality in American society, the growth of persistent poverty on the one hand and persistent wealth, if you like, on the other, the virtual collapse of the working class and the middle classes in between, and the persistence also of useless wars, which were draining the treasury and brutalizing our people and causing lots of damage around the world for no good reason at all. And the announcement said, come to Freedom Plaza and help make history, because something important is going to happen then. And I read that and it turned me on. I don't know if it's just wishful thinking, but the first thing, of course, I thought, as a veteran of the 60s and 70s, was for years and years I've been writing books and giving speeches, and always somebody in the audience says, yes, but if things are as you say, if the wars that we're fighting are unjustifiable, if the society is becoming more and more unequal, if various kinds of racism and prejudice and homophobia and etc. have become endemic in our society, where are the people? Why aren't people out on the street? especially if polls are showing that in excess of 60% of the people are opposing these wars, and very large numbers are also demonstrating, expressing their impatience with and their hostility to a system that is producing such radical inequality, and not just in the last few years, not just since the economic crisis, but since the 70s. In fact, why aren't people out? Why aren't they demonstrating? And I would give my answers. And some of you have heard me talk, well, you know, will probably have heard my answers before October of this year, talking about, all sorts of reasons that people felt demoralized, all sorts of reasons that people felt that Obama would solve all their problems. Some people felt that Obama would solve their problem. Reasons also, most interestingly, that if one compares the movement of the 60s and 70s to what's going on now, which would take us all night to do, and it's a very important comparison, because that's the last time people came out with this kind of energy and this kind of imagination and expressed themselves. One of the things that was in the background when that happened was about 20 years of the most sensational economic boom that anybody had ever seen. And the movement of the 60s and 70s was sort of carried forward on the wave of a great wave of economic, they were the crest of the wave of economic expansion and economic growth, which had raised expectations, among other things. And certainly raised expectations of young people who didn't think that the denouement to all of this development should be they're going to Vietnam and getting shot in the jungle. And so part of the reason that I would give why there were not more people in the streets and so forth was that the economy wasn't so good. Because there was economic stagnation. Query whether the shock of the great economic downturn beginning in 2008 was in some ways the equivalent of the draft for a previous generation. That is to say, if it's true, as some people think, that it's a shock that, go back to those of you who've studied the Davies J-curve, this will be familiar to you, that events suddenly take a turn for the worse and people are shocked out of their previous consciousness. Well, maybe so. But the fascinating thing, of course, was that in the 60s and 70s, although people like me, who are kind of older, I was a little old for the movement, and got involved with the left, with the Marxist left, in fighting against the Vietnam War and social injustice. We tried in vain to really put the class issue in the forefront of the movement of the 60s and 70s. We, meaning my various different groups that I worked with, were all the time talking about how the basis for this problem was American imperialism, was the empire, and the empire was a product of late capitalism, talking about the way American society was dividing between poor and rich, talking about how you couldn't have an anti-war movement, you couldn't have a women's liberation or a gay liberation or anybody else's liberation movement without also talking about the class situation in America, and it fell on deaf ears. And of course, we didn't just talk about it, we worked with the unions, we worked with labor organizations of different kinds, and basically got nowhere. Now, fast forward 40 years, and we find, in a sense, the opposite thing has happened. That is to say, the Occupy movement has developed, at the end of an economic downturn, or not the end, in the middle, perhaps, of an economic downturn, at the end of a period of wars, when the wars are, in fact, are being liquidated by the American administration. These wars, in the way they have been fought, are being liquidated. It doesn't mean war is being liquidated, it doesn't mean the American empire is going out of business, as much as Johan Galtung and other people would like to think that it is. But the wars that mobilize such strong opposition are ending. And now we have a movement which has put the class issue at the center. Maybe not phrased necessarily that way, but has put the issue of the way the economic system works at the center. And if we go down to Occupy Washington, D.C., or Occupy D.C., or Occupy Wall Street, or Occupy anywhere, and say to people, do you think that economic problems that we've been having are just a blip on a phase of the business cycle? Is this one of those downturns that we have that gets followed by an upturn after you just wait a while and everything will be all right? You would be shouted down. People understand that what's gone wrong is systemic. That there's something fundamentally wrong with the way the capitalist system at this stage of its development in the West, not just the United States, in the West, is operating. And what to do about it? Well, in one sense, people don't know what to do about it. That is to say, they do not pull out of their pocket, here's the Vanguard Party that you should all join, and then everything will be okay. On the other hand, to say that they don't know what they're interested in or they have no program is nothing but media obfuscation. In Freedom Plaza, for example, the Occupy Washington, D.C. people have a 12-page document which starts with tax measures, goes on to subsidies, goes on to social welfare programs, goes on to government employment programs, and goes on and on and on. And all you have to do is go to www.occupywashingtondc.org and you can read it. So anytime anybody tells you these people don't know what they want, just tell them, well, read the document. I'll at least tell you what some people, well, they don't claim to speak for other occupations. So, to conclude, I've spoken long enough. There are some exciting similarities between the older movement and the current movement. The most exciting similarity is that people are standing up and expressing themselves. A quite diverse group of people are standing up and expressing themselves, ranging from students to the unemployed, to not as diverse a movement as one would like to see. We can talk about that later. Racially and so forth, it's not nearly diverse enough. But still, it's not just a campus-based movement, although it's strong on campuses and getting stronger. But also a similarity that I find fascinating and important is that these are people who have decided that there has to be some relationship between means and ends. And if they want a radical change in the system, they can't play the political game as usual. They can't write their congressman. They can't vote for Mr. X or Ms. Y instead of their opponent. They need to go outside the accepted universe of political discourse. That's happened every time there's been an important movement for radical change in America, going back to the abolitionists and the opposition to the Fugitive Slave Acts and so forth, and coming up to the unions, who were not only striking but doing sit-down strikes at a time when that absolutely horrified respectable people in the nation. Interestingly enough, these activities tend to be not so much illegal, not so much violent, as extra-legal, as operating in that kind of gray area, the way the Civil Rights Movement did, for example, when it's not really clear what is legal and what's not. But with a flair for the dramatic, with a way of symbolizing what's on people's minds, just as much as Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman symbolized what was on a lot of people's minds without even knowing it by nominating a pig for president in 1968 and releasing the pig in Daley Plaza, Chicago, which was really the act, I think, that began the movement in some important ways. Occupation has that kind of drama to it. If you speak to the wiser heads in the movement, they will all tell you that occupation is not an end in itself, that they don't think they're going to make a revolution by occupying squares.
that this is not, camping out is not the end of this movement, that it's a stage, it's a movement. Kevin Zeese at Freedom Plaza says it's a movement in diapers. And that's the first stage of the movement. But it's very similar to past movements in American history that have gone outside the universe of accepted discourse in order to express ideas that are outside also the universe of accepted ideas. In this case, and this is what we will come to later, and I'll stop talking, the idea that this movement ought to maintain its independence, that it should not become an arm of the Democratic Party, the Obama campaign, the Republican Party, Ron Paul's Legion of Libertarians, or any other movement, that it should maintain its independence and evolve. And with a little time and a lot of discussion between people who are willing to listen to each other, talk, and try to arrive at collective decisions, there are going to be some important breakthroughs, I think, in terms of what kind of system we need in America. Not necessarily a two-party system, certainly not the kind of capitalist system we've got. That's to be decided. But the fact that it's in the process of being decided, and I don't think this movement is going to go away, is great. I think it's wonderful.
Well, let me thank Michael for organizing a fascinating event, and just begin with a story. I remember when I was coming out to ICAR, what was called ICAR at the time, I prepared for it in a particular way. First, I have to say the first point of contact I ever had was this guy right here. He said, "When are you going to come out and interview?" I thought, why not? Let me give this thing a shot. I had no clue what conflict analysis and resolution really was at the time. I have to admit, I was a sociologist. I thought, how am I going to figure out what this thing is? And so I grabbed a book, went down to the libraries in Wisconsin and Madison. I went down to the library and I grabbed a book. And I believe it was Rich Rubenstein's Second American Revolution, is that what it was called? Is that what it was?
You're one of the 14
Yeah. Yeah.
Left turn.
Left turn.
Left turn.
And it was the Second American Revolution, written in 1972.
That's right.
And it's a fantastic book. It just, the timing wasn't exactly right. And what's great about it, he foreshadowed it here, but I think what's fascinating about the book, and it feels, I have to say, reading the book at the time, I thought, this is cool, I like this. And what I liked about it was that its analysis of what was going on in America was intriguing and right on in many ways, but it was just taking a long view. And it seemed really out of place in certain settings, and of course, if you know what happened in '72, it didn't seem exactly right on at that moment after the fact. But you see, here we are again. And to read the book is quite different today. And I remember I thought, if a guy like that if he can write a book in 1972, there must be something brave. There must be something worth doing, and maybe this place is worth coming to and giving it a shot. And it turns out here I am. And I'm thinking about this panel even we see here, and you see the generational coverage, right? We have quite, we sort of span it in a way, and I think it has everything.
Senility.
You got my question? So we have the whole thing. And that's it. So what I'm saying is that there's something cool about it, and that to me is a movement, and also what I think is exciting about it is it shows the diversity of perspectives that are going to have to be in play to get this thing rolling in any kind of interesting way. And what I mean by this thing is a reaction to a historical singularity, a moment when things are going to be different. And I think what I can say with some degree of confidence, and I think a lot of people do say this, but I think that there is reason to believe that something big is going to happen. It's happening already. And what the thing is that this genie is out of the bottle. It may not turn out well, and I think one has to recognize that. But it certainly is going to turn out, right? Something is going to happen. And I think that Rich hits exactly on the point that we ought to be asking ourselves. And I think that when Michael and I, we were talking about this event a while back, and the idea of, well, what do you do now? What's happened is the problem is there. And I think what the movement has been extremely successful doing is in putting the problem out. And so now the question is what happens, and I think that part of what happens in history, and what we don't fully understand in perspective of social science, is that it is quite contingent. And I think what I want to propose today is some theoretical groundwork, if you will, to start to play around with what it is that might make a difference, so that we might think about strategy in a more effective way. And I can't think without PowerPoint, and so I've decided to put up with just a couple simple ideas. And one of the things you'll see when you look into strategy, what people are doing with strategy, is that they're engaged in a certain kind of competition. And I think right now what's happening is there's a competition around, it looks like, economic inequality. And with the currency of strategy is narrative. You see that we're starting to get interested in narrative. Those of you who've read Michel Foucault are already interested in discourse. These kinds of things have been around since the late 60s, this new movement. But I think that narrative, and what we mean more broadly when we speak about narrative, stories, these kind of things, are becoming extremely relevant. When I think about what needs to happen for this movement to have any success, is it needs to have a story that is compelling. The reason why drama works is because drama is the enactment of a certain kind of narrative. One of the things about the civil rights movement, it seems to me, is that it had such a good story. It still has a great story, and we're celebrating it even today. It's a wonderful story, and it makes us feel good about ourselves. Well, what is missing, it seems to me, is a good story about class in this country. We've never had a particularly good one. We have the New Deal, and there's a fascinating story there. But I think that if we focus our attention on story, we'll learn something. Now, the key pieces of story to me seem to be plot, character, and moral. And this is something new, I want to say. If you've seen my civil positioning theory ever before, this is what I'm doing with it. So what do I mean by plot? Well, you need a good plot. Now, those of you who read Getting to Yes, you had positions, people are fighting over positions when they're going toward interests. But what I think we need in a movement is you need some kind of policy focus. Whether it's we need more progressive taxation, or you need a union movement, or you need whatever else you might need. You have some kind of broad policy focus. It's linked by theory to some kind of problem. It becomes, in a sense, a plot. It becomes a script for how things play out, how certain kinds of interventions lead to certain kind of outcomes. It's quite general, but it has a story character to it. You also need character. These are the three, I have a theory about how, you'll see when it comes to morals of the story, but here you have different characters for the big revolutions, the French, the Russian, and what we might call the cultural revolutions that have followed in the wake of the Indian independence movements, but there are a whole host there. In the American context, we have three figures that grab our attention. We have Jefferson, who tends to stand for the first of these. We have finally Roosevelt, who managed to eke out a little bit, and you have Martin Luther King. Now, each of these stand for all three of these broad movements as well, because each of them is large enough to have represented the entire scope of justice and its opposite. But these are three that stand out. So you need characters. Well, how do these things work out? The biggest thing that you need, it seems to me, and I've hinted at it already, is you need a moral. You need some reason to be upset. You need some sense of injustice. And I think, in fact, this ties into human needs theory, and I'm going to be writing about this over the next few months. But I think that the way that we need to think about this is that when you have some horrible injustice grounded in concrete experience, but in the violation of a community, not of individuals, and I think this is the crucial piece that's missing in human needs theory, by the way, is that needs shouldn't be specified at the individual level. They should be specified at the social and cultural level. It's societies and communities, that is a society made intentional, that have needs. And when those needs are violated, you're going to have movements. Right now we have a violation that can no longer be ignored. The violation is what I'd call, in the third tier down here, equality versus exploitation. I think that the American revolutions, the classical revolutions, were primarily about freedom versus independence, and mind you, so too were many of the revolutions after World War II. We've also had movements around tolerance and supremacy. All three of these, the thing I want to say about these movements, about these morals that divide the world into the sacred and the profane, liberty versus oppression, is that, well, three of them do, and bold do, is that they have had their moments. You have moments of revolution, you have moments, you had the Civil War, you had the progressive movement, you had the civil rights movement. Now I think we're ready for another movement. And the movement has to do with the problem that can no longer be ignored by the community because the society is rendered by it. It's fraught. It's a problem that we've all known for a long time. Rich knew about it in '72. No one was paying attention. But it's still there, and it's gotten worse from, if you look at the data from '73 on, mind you. The '73 is when it starts to kick in. So it's exactly right in terms of the nature of the problem, but the problem was ignored, and it had something to do with strategy. And I want to say that these three narratives of liberation, of liberty, these three rhetorics of liberty, I like to call them, fight against one crucial one, which is security versus chaos. And if you think about this being the movement, if you will, the primary movement for justice, which most societies have embraced, we need a monopoly of violence. We need somebody who's strong to protect us. This is the classic movement. This is conservatism. All three of these alternatives are liberalism of some kind. They embrace the individual. They embrace freedom. They embrace equality, or they embrace tolerance. They embrace reason, as opposed to simply surviving. And I think that probably the most important thing to realize is that the story of liberation, and any of its variants, is going to come up against the story of security. And probably that's the way this thing is going to play out. And so you have to ask yourself, if you want to get out there and you want to struggle with this incredibly powerful, not only narrative apparatus, but political apparatus and economic apparatus, it's an incredibly powerful thing. You have to recognize that your story has to be good, and it has to be able to defeat, it has to be able to beat in honest, open, transparent conversation the alternative. And it seems to me, to get that right, to do that now, you have to focus on the crucial human need that's most violated, the priority. They're all being violated all the time. But the one that seems to me to have greatest priority is this issue of equality versus exploitation. And it seems somehow remarkably, since I haven't been doing this as long, but I've been doing it at least since the mid-90s. And it's been as glaring to me since then. Somehow it's glaring to everyone now. And it's going to become more so. And I think that when something like that is recognized, when you have a Rosa Parks, suddenly things are different. Why? Well, they aren't really any different. Matter of fact, they might be a little better. But they're different because now the story is in action. And I think now what we're seeing is the question is, what is the story going to be? And in order to get that story right, you have to recognize, I think, what this movement has done, and what I actually like about the 99% thing, is that it focuses on in a way that is impossible to ignore the moral of equality versus exploitation, as distinct from freedom versus dependence, as distinct from tolerance versus supremacy. That is, it highlights in a clean way the thing that that could be the solution to the others in this current conjuncture. At least that's the sense that I have. So let me just close with another idea, and the idea is the proximate reason for me being here, and that is that I wrote finally for the Unrest magazine, which I'm really happy to have finally done. And what I wrote there had to do with an idea of, I wrote for a conflict resolution community, but I was also interested in the process of social transformation, because it seems to me that that what we face right now is as much a question of social transformation as it is about de-escalation, if you will. And I know that we mean it in a much richer sense, but I know that this is dividing the community. Well, it seems to me that in order for a movement to work, in order for a movement thought in a very broad sense, I don't mean an Occupy movement, but as a specific group of people who know one another, who are doing things together. But in order for a larger movement to work, something as big as the Civil Rights Movement, let's say, something as big as the French Revolution, say, okay. In order for something like that to work, it's got to have a diverse array of styles and a diverse array of, let's say, coalitions. And by that, so what I think it needs is, it needs both a bad cop, that is someone who's revolutionary, who's challenging, who's confrontational, who does not accept what is going on in any way, and it also needs a good cop. And by the good cop, what I mean here is I actually mean the Democratic Party. Because I think what is going to happen, if you're going to see anything like a transformation of the conditions of economic exploitation in the United States, and which has implications for the world, you're going to have to shame and bludgeon the Democratic Party into some kind of virtuous action on this regard. And I say that because I think it's impossible in the United States for a long-term movement, let's say a long-term political development, to move forward without the Democratic Party. And so therefore, what it does not mean is it doesn't mean the Democratic Party is going to be the party that we know, but it might be a very, very different party. And in order to get there, you need the bad cop. And the bad cop is that social force which says no. I don't go along, and if you do, and let me get a little preface. By the bad cop, I say there's a thing called, you have 30% of people who are persuaded one direction, 30% another, and 40% who are persuadable either way. Those people can be thought of as persuadable Americans, and they're like a witness who doesn't want to cooperate. In order to get that witness to get into the process, that is to cooperate with you, you've got to have both sides of this negotiation. And why is the bad cop important? The revolutionary, the movement. Why do you need the movement? You need the movement because if you're not afraid of what the bad cop is going to do, that is by bringing in policies you don't like, which most Americans are not going to like the policies that they would read down at McPherson Square. They would not accept them. I mean, maybe it's an unfortunate truth, but it's true. What you can do is you can say, if you don't go along with my good cop solutions, you may get this. And I want to suggest that this is exactly what's happened since 1972. That's the dynamic that's been in play on one side of the divide and not the other. We've got a bad cop, which was started by Barry Goldwater, and it was carried on by Ronald Reagan, and it's now, and then the inheritor of that tradition was Newt Gingrich, and guess what? The bad cop has become the good, potentially, and there are even worse cops than him. So you see what happens is you have a movement of the window, because the left has been terrified of the bad cop since 1972. And the bad cop then for them was George McGovern. So you see, by not having that threat of an alternative that may never be realized, doesn't mean that you have to become brutal tyrant, right? Or someone who's coercive in the sense that they would impose policies people don't want. But you've got to have the threat of that. You've got to have some kind of alternative in place where you have a conversation. And I think it actually moves the dynamic in the direction that it needs to go. And the last thing I'll say about this is that the left has had many alternative bad cops, and what happens? The left kills its bad cop. That's the nature of the left in America. And what makes the American left different from all others is we will not tolerate the bad cop. Now, the reasons why that I don't know. There are many. It may have to do with the fact that we like to be nice or civil or whatever it may be, or that we have this dominant ideology. There are all kinds of reasons that might happen. But every time the bad cop comes up, and this is what Occupy is facing and what might well happen to it, is that it looks unreasonable. People become uncomfortable with even the notion that you might use some kind of coercive alternative. Coercive in essence just meaning policies people don't like. They balk and they want to be reasonable. And the other side does not do it. The last time this happened was 2000, and the character in the story was Ralph Nader. And I think you just have to search your feelings about Ralph Nader and you know what happened. Ralph Nader was saying exactly what people are saying today. The storyline was all there. If you go back and read his speeches, you look at what he was trying to do. He was articulating an anti-corporate message. He said, if you don't do something now, you're going to be in trouble. Look down the road 12 years from now. All of it's there. And I'm not trying to say you ought to get behind Ralph Nader. What I'm trying to say is Ralph Nader is a symbol of what's likely to happen in the United States in 2012, unless there can be some recognition that there needs to be a viable left. And it doesn't mean that the viable left becomes the governing majority. And I think this is maybe the final point. I don't think that the Occupy movement in all its variants should become part of the Democratic Party. I don't think that it ought to become part of the partisan system at all. I think it ought to have alternatives. I think people involved in the movement ought to have some engagement with the party, but that it shouldn't be subsumed by it. And I think this is a notion of extra-political action. That is, and I say this because I think that the viability of a third party as something that lasts more than 2 election cycles is not there. I see no history of it other than the Republican Party itself. And you needed a civil war to get there. We will not have a civil war, whatever you might like to see. It will not happen. And third parties since then have never emerged. And they are so entrenched, they're so part of almost the constitutional system, and occasionally formally so, I do not think you'll ever dislodge the Democratic Party for a third party in a viable long-term sense. Now, you may not be able to have one that's there, that nips at the heels, that's a problem, but I tell you, I think the third party, and I think Ralph Nader's decision, was a nuclear option. I think it was a decision, and I think that's what destroyed him. I think that it destroyed him because he used the nuclear option And he did it in a time when people were really not ready, were not convinced it was time for the nuclear option. And he suffered for it. And we blame him for our own failure. Okay? And that's the reality of the situation. And so what I think you need to have is you need to have pressure, and I think the Tea Party has demonstrated it. They have not yet used the nuclear option. They may do it. There's always the fear of the bad cop. You see what my metaphor? But the bad cop is not allowed to do the damage because bad cops create more problems than they solve. So that's really the major position.
I want to thank Rich and Solon. I know Rich is chomping to get a response, but I think that he's going to wait because, again, I think you have two positions here, both on the left, emphasizing there's a huge issue coming into left politics in the United States. And a question I would put forth, and then I want to open it up to whatever you all have to say, is did we frame this wrong from the get-go to ask the question of occupying the left? I mean, is that even fair on our part? Because I think in some sense you can obviously make the case that's been made here, but I know there are plenty of people that would reject that claim outright. And with that said, does anybody have any responses to start with?
Could you recap the two arguments? I'm sorry, I had horrible time.
Sure. I will let Rich recap his points because I'm sure he would like to add in a few responses.
Well, no, I mean, I was talking about, in very kind of general terms, about the revival of mass protest in the U.S., and I made some comparisons between the movement of the 60s and 70s and what's going on now. And I don't know how much of a recap I should give. One of the things that I was talking about is the centrality of class-based issues now to American politics, and the fact that the Occupy movement did that, put those issues back on the agenda. And I also talked about the determination of the Occupy people, at least the ones I know, to remain independent of the Democratic and Republican parties, and to try to use this space now that they've got and this moment to develop some creative solutions to systemic problems based on the feeling that is very strong in the Occupy movement that it's the system that's the problem, not just greedy people, not just people who made some mistakes. And of course, that's why Solon and I will, to some extent, disagree about what comes next, probably. Or maybe not what comes next, but what should come next. And Solon, by the way, has written a wonderful book that's coming out soon. You should read it, called "The Eclipse of Equality," about really all the events kind of leading up to Occupy. The book should really sell well, I think, and it's absolutely worth reading. Where we're going to disagree a little bit in a comradely, Escarly sort of way, of course, is whether if you want to change the system, you can basically try to create a pressure group on the Democratic Party and change it that way. It would seem to me, let me say a couple of things about it. First of all, Solon mentioned the contrast between the liberation movements and the problem of chaos, and the fact that people also want order. But interesting, if you read recent theorists of political change like Zizek and Badiou and others, one of the things they're talking about is the need to, if you want to have a movement that's revolutionary, not in the sense of people shooting at each other, but in the sense of a movement that is going to actually change the name of the game, change the way we do business. You cannot put yourself on the side of chaos and in opposition to the forces of order. You have to present yourself as a new source of order. Because one of the things people hate about capitalism is that it's chaotic. Because that it makes life so random, right? So uncertain. Everything's a gamble. And most of the gambles don't work out well for most of us. So to be able to present a system that you're
going to be developing as an alternative to the one that's going. And that presentation has to be made in terms of this is a system which will enable people to live a more human life. And that includes actually a more orderly life, a more predictable life, a more secure life. Social security, after all, is also about security. So, if people are talking about human security these days, you know, and that's one way to sort of linguistically jump the gap. But I think the most difficult question is the one Solon poses, and that is, you've got a two-party system. What he didn't talk about, and I'd like him to, or I'd like you to, is what do you do with a party that's been bought and sold? What do you do with a party that's so much in the pockets of the big corporations that after they drive the economy off the cliff, they all get hired back to restore the economy? And, gee, the economy doesn't get restored. What a shock. Tim Geithner wrecked it, but he doesn't seem to be able to restore it. So if we're not going to have a system run by the Geithners and the Goldman Sachses, if we're going to have something, I don't know what, call it, I would call it socialism because I'm a socialist, but lots of people in the movement aren't. And socialism may not be where it comes, how it plays out. Maybe it plays out in the form of a kind of New Deal. As Solon mentioned, the New Deal. It's kind of the last time we had a major crisis in America. There was a creative solution. There were some creative solutions that actually didn't solve all the problems by a long shot, that actually preserved the capitalist system. I'm not sure whether we should thank Roosevelt for that or not. But it did represent radical reform. It represented something that did not fall easily, could not easily be categorized as kind of Band-Aid reform on the one hand or bloody revolution on the other hand. It never would have happened without hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, on strike, etc. Something really close to social chaos in 1934 and 1935 that created the basis for the turn left, for Franklin Roosevelt's turn left. So, I mean, I think we have to stay in the streets. I mean, I think we have to, in fact, increase the pressure from the streets. Is it possible that you could put so much pressure on the Democratic Party that it would cease to be the party of the corporations and become the party of the people? And nothing's impossible. You know, I mean, de Klerk, left power in South Africa. I mean, lots of things that seemed impossible happened. But I would not be so quick as Solon is to write off the possibility of some kind of transformation of the party system. I mean, most democracies in the world have multi-party systems. You know, you have most European countries having one form or another a four-party system. And could we be evolving towards a multi-party system? Katrina vanden Heuvel at The Nation, the editor of The Nation, thinks that that's where we're headed. Well, I don't know. You know, just these kind of mechanical changes, like increasing the number of parties, doesn't necessarily solve the problem either. The only place that I find myself at all in disagreement with Solon, and I'm not sure we even do disagree on this because we haven't talked about it, is that I think that control of the economy by the great corporations, which is now global, now equals control of the state. And whether you have one party, two parties, or 8 parties, if those are the people controlling the system's not going to change. They're discovering it in Greece, they're discovering it in Spain, and Portugal, and Italy, and they're going to discover it here too. That it's more and more coming down to a choice. You want to be ruled by these people or not? And then there is lots of question marks. Will those people give up if the pressure on them gets great enough? Can we keep the movement nonviolent? I certainly hope so. But there are a lot of question marks. I don't see how you change the system by keeping the same billionaires in power. And one further note, the allegedly conservative Supreme Court now issues what's basically a counter-revolutionary decision. The craziest decision, if you're really a conservative, that anybody could imagine, saying you cannot regulate campaign financing. within the bounds of the Constitution, within the bounds of the First Amendment, thereby presenting us with the choice. Can we get a constitutional amendment? Or can we somehow shift can we pack the Supreme Court? Now I know why Roosevelt wanted to pack the Supreme Court, right? Or should we just say to hell with the Supreme Court, let's do what we think is right? I mean, when the chief legal authority takes the position which says this system, which is a plutocracy, is constitutionally protected. The plutocracy is constitutionally protected. That's trouble. If you're interested in conflict resolution, you don't want a decision like that to ever have been made. But it has been made, so it shows maybe the extent to which the deck is stacked. And why you don't think this might be a Republican Party? I mean, why? This is an interesting historical question anyway. The circumstances under which a third party could become viable. I don't know. I don't think, I don't know. I don't think it does take a civil war. But anyway, we'll talk about that.
Archie.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for your comments. And I think the issue that seems to be coming to the fore is the one that was on my mind, which is that this is framed as occupying the future of the American left, not occupying the future of the left. And so it seems to me that one of the points at which this argument diverges is whether this is really an American movement or whether this is an anti-global movement or a global anti-movement. And so my question, which Ritz has already addressed in part, but I'm interested in hearing Solon's perspective, and everyone else's perspective for that matter, is if this movement is really about reforming the American system in a way that's substantial and addresses the concerns of the aggrieved, how is that possible in a system in which the national has become subordinate to the capital? And when there's clearly, sort of a coordinated effort among Western democracies, put in quotes, to push back against these populist movements of the left, to preserve neoliberalism, to preserve, the corporate plutocracy. Does an American movement can an American movement really win the day in terms of real reforms? Does the outcome of an American election or a set of American elections, can that really change the system if the system is completely embedded, financially with sort of a West that's wedded to capitalism and a developing world that is clamoring for the West's capital?
I think, of course, this is the most important point to raise, and really the spark that lit was Tunisia, obviously, that produced Madison, Wisconsin, that was called the Tunisia of the Midwest, and of course in Spain, and then now we had a reaction. So it's obviously a global movement, there's no question. And I think that the most important inequalities are not within nations but between them, and I grant that. I also think that you hit on something which is really important, which is that nations, even the United States, is what states used to be with respect to corporations. That is, states used to have to bid for corporate, let's say, relocation, and they got played. They weren't big enough to confront a corporation, or a locality wasn't. Now the United States is not big enough. Used to be big enough. Now Standard & Poor's can downgrade the United States credit. Wouldn't have ever had the courage to do that previously. And now Europe, even this week, is facing the same thing. You see basically the corporate bureaucracy, which is what it is. It's a complicated, multifaceted bureaucracy, but it's a bureaucracy. We don't like to think about it. It's not an individual, obviously. They're not individuals. They're massive bureaucracies which regulate and plan, just like socialist economists do. They just do it within the private system. Now they're big enough that the actual bureaucracy, the public bureaucracies are no longer big enough. Well, now, I think that the important question comes in. If it's true that the injustice is more between nation than within, why get all jazzed about an American left, right? Why get all jazzed about a German left? Why care about what happens in the first world at all? Well, I say this. It seems to me that if the period from 1968 to now, as I argue, has been characterized by the eclipse of equality, that is the dismantling of the left, frankly, it seems to me to be a complete collapse, just one thing upon another. If that's true, then what has that done for global inequality? It doesn't seem like it's done a lot of good. It seems to me that at the very least, and this is where I come off with a set of paradoxes, I think it's important for the movement to be independent, that is this movement to be independent and to be radical and to say exactly the things Rich is saying, and to be upset with people like me. I expect that, and I want that. I want that to happen. But I also want there to be a part which is sort of also working the other side. And that's my good cop imagery. Because what I'd like to see is I'd like to see both a Democratic Party that's doing something, and I'd like to see an America that's no longer trying to play an active role in promoting the Washington Consensus in the way that it's been conceived in the 1990s, which seems to me to be at the root of a lot of the problem. Because you see, control of the centers of power matter. That's my argument. That's my sense. That's what I believe. I believe it matters to who controls the most important centers of power. China may be an evolving one, but it's still the case the United States has a lot. I mean, the legacy of the United States is going to be important even in an Asian century. The same way that the British have no right to have any control in the world today, but do. The French do. Why? Institutional legacies. The United States government is going to have a legacy. And so therefore I think that an American left at least has a role and is not the whole thing. The Democratic Party is not the whole thing, but it has to be some piece of it. And it's the only piece I feel I have any potential influence over. And so therefore I am interested in it and haven't yet given up on it.
So I will get yours in just a second, but I want to follow up Solon's point with, this is the docket, this is a publication our law school puts out, and one of our future lawyers, what I guess, I do not know this gentleman, but Mr., get his name here, Matt Davis. I think Solon's comments about narrative become even more important, and maybe so in the legacy of, when America isn't the only superpower left in the world, pushing everyone around, what does that legacy look like to the rest of the world? And I want to read what he wrote, because I'm pretty sure he's winning the battle for legacy. And he writes, "The occupiers, like many in the civilized world, have come to believe that need and want constitute the right to something. We are no longer entitled to simply life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but now clearly have the right to health care, food and shelter, home ownership, etc., etc. To the occupiers, it is no longer the responsibility of the individual to procure these so-called rights, but it is rather the job of the federal government through whatever means necessary. They argue that it is simply not fair that the top 1% live in luxury while the others going without, regardless of the circumstances." He goes on in
I want to fund this guy.
a lengthy tirade to basically claim that the legacy that we are leaving is fend for yourself, and that's the right one. And I think, as Solon's point, the bad cops of the 2012 election would like to hire this guy as a campaign manager. And I'm fairly certain, thanks to talking to many of my international friends who go here, that the legacy of the United States abroad is looking a lot like this legacy. And I'm kind of hopeful that Occupy can change that. But maybe that's a naive hope, and you had a point you wanted to make right there.
I wanted to go back to the issue of parties actually. I really don't understand why we should emphasize political parties at all. Since Wall Street began actually in October of 2010, 9 governments have fallen in Europe. All of them have been replaced by technocrats, without election, without anything. and there is a movement against political parties. In Iceland today, they are meeting to draft a constitution by the people, organized by the communities. In November, Occupy Wall Street issued a beautiful statement which essentially said they would like to be away from political parties and go directly as people mobilization, community mobilization. What is wrong with that? Why can't we go from here straight to community mobilization? An important point actually, you know, when you quoted Mahatma Gandhi, just before India's independence, Mahatma Gandhi recommended that the political parties be abolished because it will never cater to the community. He called the political parties as gundas, which means thugs. And he himself quit as the president of the Congress party, which was then in power at that time actually.
Well, you know, Bala, that's an indication of how dangerous, that there are some dangers involved here that we haven't been talking about, right? It's a dangerous, when democracy, when representative democracy of the kind we've got disgraces itself, when the parties look like clowns, arguing with each other, unable to reach even, you know, the most any kind of sensible decision. And democracy falls into disrepute. This kind of democracy, at least, falls into disrepute. Then the door is open to all kinds of devils and some good possibilities and bad possibilities. The parliamentary Democrats disgraced themselves before the rise of fascism in the 30s. And the fascists came and said, you know, away with
depression, mind you.
away with them, right? Away with these talkers. They can't solve problems. We'll solve your problems for you. But also new forms of democracy appear.
Yeah.
And some people in the Occupy movement would like to think, and it may be naive of them, or it may be an illusion, that they're trying to model some new forms of democracy just in the way they do business among themselves. But I think, I mean, that's why there's the old socialist slogan was socialism or barbarism. That if you don't have a new form, whether it's socialist or not, if you don't have a new viable forms of democratic self-expression, you can get really nasty forms of undemocratic rule.
That's great, and I think that's fantastic. And the other thing I want to say is that if fascism is one reaction to moving beyond political parties, so too is progressivism in its original form. One of the things the progressives,
That's right.
back in the around 1912, Obama just gave a speech. Was he going to? I feel like he's already given it, which is, he's going to give it, I think, which evokes Teddy Roosevelt. That's his new mom. So one of the crucial things that the progressives wanted to get rid of political parties for exactly this reason. Well, where have they gotten rid of political parties? That's very much alive in the United States. It's in places where you don't want to put up, like many local elections, you don't want to put up signals of the corrupt factional bosses and what have you. One of the problems is the working people are less attentive, people who are less educated are less attentive, they're not as involved, they don't know as much about about who the parties represent. Those who are better organized, richer, and more prestigious then take advantage of that, and it's very difficult to send a signal. In fact, Anthony Downs' theory of economic democracy suggests that, and this goes back, which is an economistic theory of democracy, which that parties are useful and they send a clear market signal of who you are and who you represent. And if you think about it, it's very difficult to know in a community supposedly organized autonomously among rational individuals without factions who you might side with. It sounds very good. It's a progressive alternative. It probably has a role to play. I'm actually quite concerned when you see parties falling apart entirely. I prefer to see 4 parties than I would to see no parties, because it seems to me that that the only people who will be able to have influence in a no-party system is the billionaire. That's my suspicion. Even worse than the American Senate.
The real question to me is that what kind of transformational change are we seeking, and how do we best bring it about? And if you again go back to the Occupy Wall Street website, it has a beautiful plan in terms of how do we get from here to the community. And I think we need to really look at it more carefully than Professor Spindler did.
Excuse me, thank you. I worked in Congress for about 10 years, and almost exclusively with the Progressive Caucus and set up, and that's 80 members, right? And I set up the Progressive Caucus Foundation outside of Congress to support them. And it was always really interesting to me how the progressives in Congress just could not deliver anything, even with 10 committee chairmanships. And a lot of that, and I worked with both Democrats and Republicans, and on national security issues, but I worked a lot in Northern California, so it was very liberal. And one of the things I noticed is how just miserably organized for influence the left's most visible constituencies are. The tactics of the sort of 60s are still sort of template, which I call, it's like maneuver warfare politics that surround and punish, flank and punish, yell at them before, during, and after. So the level of sophistication can't compete with the sort of owning the institutional terrain that the right has achieved. I mean, the Mercatus, that's a right-wing funder. George Mason, the think tanks, half of them here, are funded by right-wing corporate interests, so there's no illusion why that kind of stuff shows up in the editorial page.
No, no.
If you look at sort of follow the money. But you're right, I mean, on the Hill, the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans where money is concerned is the difference between, bribery and hush money. The Republicans, it's solely part of their ideology to just accept bribery, and the Democrats shut up. And you can see it with the corporate funding. If you look at the PAC spending, it's about 40-60, 40-60, 40-60. I mean, I follow this on defense spending. It's just enough to shut you up at home, right? But what seems to me also that's happened over the last few years, certainly after the Citizens United decision, is that the comparative advantage of the left and the right have reached their point of diminished returns. Does that make sense, that the comparative advantage is right what you specialize in, and diminished returns is when one additional one actually is counterproductive? And on the left, it's noise, and on the right, it's money. So you've got this saturated system that no longer responds. And what I've noticed about progressives, and this includes these 80 members of the Progressive Caucus, who I love, but are huge pains in the ass to work with because a lot of them are 60s and 70s and really stuck in this whole surround and punish model. And I'll tell you what the internet equivalent of that is today. It's just contact, move on, and send millions of emails to Congress that staff can't possibly handle. And the noise level there is not humanly possible to deal with. Is that we also haven't created useful, trustable filters. We don't spend our political capital. We don't spend our social capital well. I mean, the only thing that compete with money capital is social capital. And there's this whole, the Putnam book 10 years ago now, I would suggest people reread that. Is like, we are at the point where we can start spending social capital in the most fabulous ways enabled by technology. And that's what has to happen next. It's being influential without being physically present. That's not happened any time in history before. And I figure, what I see, I'm in my 40s, and I think my generation has been just missing in action in providing mentorship and help to the millennials. Because we have all this institutional knowledge and not the same sense of obligation as the boomers to help. And I don't know if you guys are doing anything out here, but there's just huge vacuums in civic life that could be colonized right now by Occupy Wall Street that are very institutionally meaningful. I mean, I can give you dozens of them inside Congress. That Gingrich came in and wiped out. He is the serial killer of the common good.
Wait till not yet.
It's like putting Ted Bundy in charge of a girls' camp to elect this guy president. He ruins everything, and if you just look at the history of what he's done, it's remarkable. And so there's all this stuff, like if we had corporate mindsets, we'd be going in there and identifying the vacuums and filling them in institutionally meaningful ways. And I just want to say it's not impossible at all. We had 10 committee chairmanships for 4 years when I was working on the Hill, and still couldn't find this community that enabled or created the political space and the meaningful ways to move forward. My sense is like the conflict resolution community, I mean, I came out of it too. has the process knowledge to redesign this.
Well, I mean, I want to say that the Progressive Caucuses, the problem with them is not only that they're 260s-ish, although they may be, but also the problem is, one way to illustrate it is I went to at that point, the leader of the Progressive Caucus and said, how would you like to have a series of presentations that you would sponsor to Congress, to staffers and so forth, on conflict resolution, and how conflict resolution people would propose to, the kind of process that they would use to resolve very serious conflicts. And oh, they said, that's great. And we'd do a series of major conflicts in the world and show how you get to the underlying causes and all that. Oh, they said, that's great. And I said, we'll start with, Palestine, Israel. I said, are you kidding?
That's not the one to start with.
It's not the one to finish with either.
No,
It's not
you're
the one
right.
they want to have anything to do with.
But
Because they're just as dependent on campaign financing, et cetera, as the non-progressive.
yeah, but I mean, as somebody again who worked on the Hill, and as soon as the votes happened, started getting the phone calls. And this was a Marin County district, right? So it's not conservative at all. The Goon Squad tactics, there's just no meaningful, like, knowledge and facts don't have an effective political constituency. Climate scientists just took out a legal defense fund. That should scare all of us. They're going to start defending themselves instead of doing climate science.
Anyway, what you had to say is very interesting.
But knowledge does not have a meaningful political constituency in the institutions that we're stuck with. And a lot of it, and I came out of a total ivory tower that has all the answers in the world. It's Stanford, it's Silicon Valley, and it was not involved in a meaningful way, hardly ever, except at the individual level where faculty take huge risks to their careers to become politically interested. That exists around this country. I mean, the distributed knowledge and expertise we have to fix this problem exists. It's figuring out how to create a political constituency for evidence-based decision-making.
I want to jump to Connor. I saw you
Sure.
wanting to jump in on the tech.
I just have a question, because I think that you talked about it earlier, was talking about the messages in Occupy Wall Street. I work in the message industry as a web designer, so I'm fascinated with how the use of wording in the Occupy movement has been used, and especially with social media now, because obviously the Occupy movement, there's no leader, there's no straight message, but we're hearing words of, the 99% versus the 1% and the 57 versus the 43% and those kind of things. Since we're talking about the future of the left and the future of this movement, how do you think message is influencing moving forward? What's the next steps for the Occupy movement and that sort of thing?
Well, I think that's a question everybody should try to answer, we're not the experts on that. And my only little shot at an answer would be that the reason I'm not entirely comfortable with the 1% and 99% as good a slogan as it is, as effective a slogan as it is because it divides society into a tiny elite defined by their income or their wealth, and everybody else who, relative to them, are the unwealthy. The 99% are not defined by anything positive. And their position in society is not described by calling them 99%. They're being defined negatively as not the people who have wealth. But in America, for a long time, the 99% have wanted to become the 1%. So, also in America for a long time, people define themselves by their consumer status, by their income and wealth status, which turns into what they can buy and how they can present themselves. That is to say, it turns into status. But if we're going to move ahead, which in some ways is also moving back, we need to, I think, get people to think of themselves in terms of class, which is the role that they play in production. They need to think of themselves as workers, not in terms of blue-collar workers. We know now that what's the transformation of the working class doesn't look like anything like the working class did, 100 years ago or 50 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago. But if people aren't identifying their plight with the fact that the system has put them in a subordinate role, and it's not just they don't have enough money, then they're not going to learn. I think what they need to learn to forge a new politics. So, I mean, that would be mine, but I think there are lots of answers to you. That's only one small answer to you.
For sure.
So I used to hear like the cliche that, you know, the two-party system in America, that Democrats and Republicans are really the same. And now the longer that I've been here, I've been here for almost 10 years, beginning to think like the positioning of the Republicans are isolating, they isolate themselves from the rest of the world. I used to hear. And, you know, Democrats are for engagement to the world and all that good stuff. But when you hear, I mean, I'm just like, when you hear like the two parties speak in America's place in the world, Republicans tend to be very attractive. We stand for freedom, we do all this stuff, whereas like the Obama would say like we stand for democracy. I don't know, I'm just trying to understand like what is why is the Democrats really seem like very like, you know, what do you call like sort of a local party, and yet Republicans can't really speak about. Anyway, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but is anybody?
No, but I think you're pointing out the fact that when it comes to an international perspective, the Democrats don't have a good message. The international community wants to work with them, but when you look at the Republican message, especially the George W. Bush era Republican message of freedom or death, we'll do whatever we want to preserve American freedom, and that when you see Democrats try to adopt that language, that it feels awkward, and that Obama can't give that talk.
Yeah.
I mean, it signals a larger problem that I think, again, goes back to Solon's point, is that even when you have the right values, say, values that we would agree with, that people need to eat, and values that the Democratic Party, when they're in their good form espouses, they fall flat. And I think that's the thing that Occupy has brought out is how essential those values are, and how easy it is to actually talk about them, and to make almost a freedom or death kind of statement about everyone should eat, and how hard it is for the Democratic Party, at least at this moment, in my opinion, to even get on board with that. Obama's speech today edged that way. He started to adopt a little, hey, you've wiped out the middle class, inequality is growing, you're not going to like what you see, but that's not taking a position. That's not saying, I'm going to fix this, I'm the guy to set this right.
It's always very shy, like, so it's like removed from...
Jeff, I want to pick up on something that Rich says about this messaging thing. I think you're exactly right, that there's a problem with the 99% thing, as there's a problem with all slogans. I mean, they're just not, slogans are what they are. We are the 99%, whatever. But I think that if in order to, what I wanted to argue tonight, and what I decided I might argue is this theoretical one was you need a story. And so I suggested that the moral is the most important thing, and you need leaders, and you need character, but you also need plot. I think one of the crucial pieces of the plot that's missing, and this might get at some of this worker thing, and it also speaks to what it is that Ralph Nader offered back in the 60s, back in, let's say, when he was taking on General Motors, is that a broader concept of bargaining power. A lot of this movement in the United States started just recently in Madison, Wisconsin. One of the things that Madison, Wisconsin was famous for was the Wisconsin idea, which is what we were actually doing in Mason County, some theory, research, and practice coming together. That was the Wisconsin idea, they used to call that. And I think one of the interesting things about that, and what people developed according to that Wisconsin idea, was that you needed a concept of bargaining power. That is, that you needed, if you're a worker, you need to be able to bargain with the employer. And it organized the notion of unions was important, what have you. But also what you came out of Ralph Nader, what you see about the consumer movement, and more broadly than Ralph Nader, is you needed as a consumer protection to bargaining power with respect to the corporation. Well, if you take bargaining power as an idea, something that's variable, it's not just there, it can't exist in markets, mind you, in neoclassical markets. There's no such thing as power. But if you introduce this radical idea to your economic theory, You say, yes, okay, liberal markets are generally good. I mean, it's nice that they work in certain circumstances. But what happens is the bargaining power accrues to bureaucracies, organized groups who take over and monopolize the situation. Well, corporations are precisely that. They monopolize large portions of the planning process. You need to have some kind of bargaining. You need to be able to have organizations which allow you in all the myriad transactions, whether it's when you're buying stock or buying a product or selling your labor or taking a loan, something very concrete, like maybe when you check your credit score for a mortgage, maybe it shouldn't go down, things like that, or maybe when you want to. Well, you can imagine all the various kinds of things you could imagine. Any kind of situation where you sit down and you try to engage in a transaction with someone else who has the power. You could imagine net neutrality in this respect. You can imagine all kinds of things. But so it seems to me that some kind of idea that people are scattered and disorganized and chaotic, but corporations are not. And that can be good. I mean, you want to plan that you have markets and hierarchies, but it seems to me that something like that, something which makes sense of that kind of concept. But I say that, and in me saying it, you already see why the 99% is working, because that's what you can make sense of.
Well, that's right. I think that's right. And to the extent that it's working, I think one reason also is because it's not economistic language. I mean, there's a danger that if you're trying to mount a real challenge to the system, that you start simply becoming another kind of policy wonk. And Americans are a religious people. They're not necessarily organized religious people. And I'm not talking about theology, but I am talking about the civil religion, which plays such an important part in any movement in the United States, from abolitionism on. So this guy actually has put his finger on something important, that people are beginning to think about what's the irreducible minimum of dignity and justice that people are absolutely entitled to. And I mean, we already have, there's always an irreducible minimum. Today, for example, if you're talking about health care, people will differ about health care. But if somebody says, well, if a person doesn't have enough money, they simply have to die. They can't get into an emergency room. The emergency room should turn them away unless they have the health insurance you can pay or something, and then they'll die. People are going to say, well, no, you've got to give those people, the people who need emergency medical aid, and then figure out how you're going to afford it. You don't make that contingent on the budget. And the Occupy movement, as if you like, a civil religious matter, is beginning to argue that there are a range of necessities that people have that need to be fulfilled and that have got to be fulfilled, whether it seems economical to fulfill them or not. Or to put it a different way, that the profit system cannot be trusted to provide certain necessities. And since the profit system alone can't provide it, the system either has to be heavily regulated or replaced by a public system. And then you get the key point, which the Occupy movement, I think, had got to come to in its debates, which is if, in fact, you are proposing a more active role for government, if you're talking about, at the very least, a New Deal, where, for example, the government's going to guarantee people jobs, and if the private sector can't provide jobs, those people are not going to be thrown out on the street. They're going to be put to work. Even Roosevelt knew that, and he was no socialist. Well, if that's the case, then you are immediately exposed to the perfectly correct criticism on the part of the right, that you mean you're going to create another monstrous bureaucracy out of touch with the people, uncontrollable, corrupt, inefficient, etc., etc. And if there's no answer to that question, the Occupy movement ends or loses. The answer to that question has got to be, yes, we are going to develop new ways of controlling a stronger government. So that the choice is not between big government and freedom. The choice is between not solving problems and solving them in a democratic way. And the way you solve problems in a democratic way is you don't worry about how strong the government is if it's our government. If there are ways we can directly control the government. And waiting every 4 years to decide, as Marx said, which member of the bourgeoisie will mislead us for the next 4 years is not an effective way of controlling the government. So you'll get it. I mean, if there are some people in the Progressive Caucus I know who would agree with this. Dennis agrees with it, Kucinich. But we're just at the beginning, I think, of trying to develop what would those means of popular control of a stronger government look like. Because if you're just going to have stronger government and no new means of popular control, then, you know, I'll vote for Ron Paul.
I also wanted to see us not conflate Occupy movement and the future of the left questions, and not set a debate in binary terms such as, you know, Democrats versus Republicans and what left versus right, or whatever, what have you. Because I would much rather see the debate centered around the question, you know, based on, you know, the future of our common humanity, and less about 99 versus 1%. I know plenty of people from 99% who are pro 1% and vice versa. But that's a different question. My question was, as conflict resolution experts, where do we place ourselves in this context? For example, as I was introduced to many authors that were writing on conflict analysis and resolution, I found that not very many brought up the issue of neutrality. And those who did bring it up, they were divided into two camps. Some of them were pro-neutrality and argued that we should never own a conflict, and the other camp argued that well, for example, James Lowy, who argued that the car field was originated around the idea of social justice. So we ought to point out system flaws and give voice to the weaker party. And otherwise, we might as well get law degree and write articles and practice ADR. So when I applied this, my personal dilemma on neutrality to Occupy movement, I was asking myself, why do I find myself more and more biased on this issue? And I figured out that there is no mechanism for giving voice to the weaker party. Since one would want to assume that the government, a stronger party in this conflict, would want to engage in public debate and sincerely understand what are the underlying deeper issues of this movement, which actually pointed out a lot of flaws in socioeconomic, political, cultural dimensions of our social structure. The government either is genuinely blind or doesn't want to sincerely engage in those issues of trying to understand those people. So how do we, without slipping into advocacy and losing more or less objective vision, where do we find ourselves as representatives of this field? Doesn't it make sense to create some sort of mechanism of practice that would mediate the dialogue between the movement and the government? And
So you're asking, is there a less painful way to tell someone they're losing their home and there's nothing we can do about it?
Well, what I'm asking is that it seems like there should be a more productive public debate on these issues, and the government is trying to turn away from it. So we as conflict resolvers, instead of hiding behind the notion of neutrality, perhaps we should let go of it and create some sort of institution, some sort of organization that would mediate between this very important social issues and social groups and the issues they bring up, the flaws that they point out in the system, and the governments that technically supposed to want to engage in those debates, but very often turn away from them.
I mean, I think there's I jump in here. But I mean, I think that the orientation is to be activist in that way in this field at present. Like I don't see a whole lot of people who would not recognize a power differential like that and say the person over here in the Occupy movement and the government are equated in any way that you could reasonably have like a conversation where you thought the two parties were talking at the same level, or that this other person was entitled to something that they were going to get at the end of the day, because we know that's not true. And anyone that's operating under an illusion, I think that Joe whoever can take on the government, like, or Mr. Smith can go to Washington these days, like I don't know what planet they're on, and maybe they're writing for this paper. But I don't know who's still arguing for neutrality in a way that would care about Occupy. Like in a way that could honestly walk down there and say, I have something to offer you because I'm neutral. And maybe that's just me, but there's plenty of conflict.
Well, you can be neutral in a kind of Habermasian universe. You can be neutral. You can say, if we could actually have a free, open debate about what kind of system we want, and if questions like were put on the table, like you have a private automobile system, they kill 45,000 people a year and maims 1 million, and you can't get where you want to go anyway, especially if you're trying to get to work. And then you have a public transportation system which is systematically starved of funds. So, I mean, that's the way I would dish it up. Other people might present the whole thing differently. But could we ever have a debate, a discussion, deliberation about what kind of transportation system we want to have? Private, public, what kind of mix? No, you can't, you're not allowed to have that debate. There's too much money invested in the private automobile, gasoline, highway, etc. Industry. So the debate never happens. So I think we're really talking about trying to create the conditions for a sort of debate where you could be neutral, in the sense that you could say, I don't know how this debate's going to come out, and I would go into it myself thinking, well, if there's a good idea presented that I've never thought of, I'll vote for that. So I mean, there's that sort of neutrality. There's a kind of Habermasian, neutrality. But when it comes to trying to figure out how to change how to change systems that are producing violent conflict, destructive conflict, and structural conflict, structural violence, so that they don't do that anymore, then we're not anti-conflict, you're anti-violence. You're anti-structural violence. And so if getting rid of the structural violence means being partisan, then it's, I think it's perfectly consistent with conflict resolution ethics to be partisan, not to be neutral. Right? So I mean, this yearning that we sort of have sometimes in our field, that let's conciliate, let's make peace. No, Jeremiah said, peace, peace. The men talk of peace, but there is no peace. To get there, to get to peace, You get there through conflict. No? So it's just a question, I think, of picking the right conflict. And, you know.
So I'm going to ask, since we're coming up on 9 o'clock, and thank you all for sticking around and being patient. Let's say, as we heard in 2010, the young people are disenfranchised with our current president, and they are not going to be voting for him in 2012. Does Occupy change that? Or are we looking at a president who's just going to walk in, given how chaotic things are? And so I'll let you do it first to have at that. Yeah.
I think that the Occupy movement is the best thing that's happened to the mainstream Democratic Party, and if you want evidence of this, just go look at Chuck Schumer, no enemy of capital. He's very out there in saying, wow, the wind's at our back. He knows full well what's up, and he knows that without what I call a bad cop, he doesn't have anything to work with. And the momentum has been moving in the wrong direction. I think that the Democratic Party was too willing to look for the progressive Republican solution. I think the Democratic Party, it's perfectly reasonable that Teddy Roosevelt is the model, because this is a Republican administration. On the classical model of the American two-party system, this is a progressive Republican administration. It's good on racial and gender issues, fantastic. It's exactly like the progressive Republicans were. It's okay thinking, worried about class, but doesn't want to do much, just like the Republicans were. And so I think that in that sense, this progressive Republican administration needs some pressure, and I think that it's going to be good for them. I also think, and I have actually thought since early October, that Newt Gingrich is going to be the nominee. And I think that I just can't see Mitt Romney winning. And so what that means is that the horror of horrors is going to happen for many on the left, but it's probably good for Obama. Why? Because what Obama failed to do, it seems to me, in 2010, and again in 2011, is even worse, was stand up to what's perceived as the bully. He does, and who's the bully? It's not about defeating the bad guys overseas. He killed Osama bin Laden, no one cares. It's about standing up to the bad guys here at home. And he didn't do it. He doesn't like to do it. His whole campaign was he's not going to do that. And I think now the bad guy, Newt Gingrich, is going to come after the bullies in his house. And I think that's a great thing for Obama, because if it happens, and I'm not saying it will, I mean, Romney certainly could pull it out, or maybe cooler heads prevail. But if you look at who carried the banner of the conservative movement after Ronald Reagan, there was no one there until Newt Gingrich came along, and he's now carrying the banner of the conservative movement now. And the bully's back in the room, and I think it's going to be good for Obama, and I think when people see that, Obama will be, it's not only the good Newt and the bad Newt, it's the good Obama and the bad Obama. The bad Obama is the guy who just wants to let everyone to get along. The good Obama is the guy who can articulate a vision that's an alternative, and he can do that very well. And I think that he's going to do well, and the young people, when they see that, when they see what the alternative is, then it'll be good. If Romney's the nominee, I think he probably has a good chance to win, because there's not much of a difference, in a sense, between the policy. I mean, the crucial differentiation is the healthcare policy, and it's all based on the 10th Amendment, that it ought to be states and not the federal government. But it's all about a mandate. That's the crucial piece. So it seems to me that the youth, what happened with youth is the youth were trending, the 18 to 29 demographic was trending to the Democrats since 2006. Now they're trending radical. But many people will get back in, I would think, if conditions, if you have a freedom versus equality conflict, which is what it looks like to me coming forward.
Sure. So here we are just waiting, auditioning the great character and waiting for whose story to make a difference at this point.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't mean, should we have a character in mind? Should we be doing something? Is that what you mean?
Well, no, just wondering until this character steps up.
Well, it seems that the character is going to be determined by the plot, in my view. And I think the plot is, I think the moral of the story is right. And I think the question is, it's not that the ideas aren't there, but which one of these myriad ideas will seem to be the one that people can stand behind, that is the policy narrative that will make sense. And will there be somebody who can rise up? And I think you will need some kind of leader ultimately. I don't think it has to be the leader of the Occupy movement, but you're certainly going to have some kind of leadership. Let me not say leader because that sounds kind of oddly fascist. But I think you need some kind of, you're going to need some kind of rallying point around which people can say, yeah, that makes sense. And if nothing else, Occupy's done at least that. I mean, it's changed the moral discourse.
I have a suggestion for you.
So-
What you could actually do with our students. Go to Congress and organize the staff to learn about what's going on. I guarantee you, they don't have, there's an on-ramp in there on all of this, and nobody's in there talking to them in person, giving them your knowledge and your options as a peer group. The Progressive Caucus was locked out of the Occupy Wall Street stuff very deliberately, shut out, and had their feelings hurt. And like, there's a huge opportunity, you're right across the river, to go over there and give them something they can actually do something about. That's what I would do if I was an ICAR student. I would be over there figuring out how to get a group of staff on the Progressive Caucus staff to start brainstorming ideas, new messages, whatever. They're about all 25 to
So,
22.
excuse me, so here, it seems to me also, what happens in these discussions is, as soon as people start talking about how are you going to get serious politically, how are you going to make serious change, people start talking about office holders. And here's my problem. I don't know even how I'm quite going to come out on it myself, but the elections are the opiate of the people. Elections are this sort of magic ritual. It reminds me of the Romans and the Christians. I mean, here you have the Christians practicing their weird rites in the middle of the Roman Empire, worshiping this guy who was crucified and so forth. And the Romans come to them and they say, listen, you want to do whatever you do in your churches, do what you do. It's okay with us. But just be sensible, will you? What we have here is public rituals where we go and we sprinkle a little powder and, and we say some words to the old gods. And we don't really believe in them either. But that's what makes us Romans, to do this. You're separating yourself from the community. I mean, and we're going to get you if you don't come out and sprinkle the powder and, say the words to Zeus or Jupiter or whoever. And the Christians, crazy fanatics, right, say, no, we're not going to do that. And they start, dying in large numbers for their faith, and they end up being the new faith. So elections are the pagan rituals of the American Empire. And we're all supposed to stop thinking about the things we've been talking about at this point and start worrying about what's going to happen in the next election. And start kind of defining ourselves politically by which party are we going to either belong to or try to pressure. How are we going to come out in the next election? The Occupy movement is saying we're not going to do that. We're going to go on doing what we're doing and have a nice election. Now, I mean, the Democrats don't like to hear that at all, and that's why their agents are all over the Occupy movement. There are people at McPherson Square, at Freedom Plaza, and on Wall Street, and every place else, from the SEIU, from the Reclaim the Dream, or whatever the hell the name of that is, that band, what's his name's movement. Yeah, I mean, the Democratic left is, trying like crazy to influence the Occupy movement, well, basically to capture it or split it. And that's going to be quite dramatic, I think, because that's going to intensify. I'm wondering if the Occupy movement maintains its independence and comes out in the spring, as it's threatening to do, and mobilizes en masse on the mall or anyplace else, whether the police are going to be so kind in the middle of an election year as they are now. I don't know. I really don't know what the answer to that is. When they're actually, if they show that they're not absorbable into the Democratic Party, there's always a possibility, I mean, I don't want to be dogmatic about this, there's a possibility that Obama will decide he's Roosevelt. And start to present a whole different face. I mean, Roosevelt turned into Roosevelt, after a while. It took him a few years, too. But I doubt it. I doubt it. I don't think it's in him, either personally or in the structure of the party, to allow that to happen. Although they will certainly try to co-opt the Occupy movement. And then for the occupiers, then there's this kind of horrible choice that, Nader, posed to us, and that's been posed from time to time. Eugene Debs, who was a socialist, once said, it's better for you to vote for who you want and not get him than to vote for someone you don't want and get him. So should we, and my reluctance to say let's pressure the Democratic Party or whatever is because I don't think the movement is strong enough yet to actually be an effective pressure group. I think it'll be swallowed whole by the Democratic Party. And I don't see even one little sign at this point, although I may be wrong, I don't see one sign that the Democrats are getting set to challenge the corporate elite. If they start to talk, you could see some signs that this is going to happen. But it has to be more than the speech that Obama just gave. It has to be something that at least looks like the New Deal. It seems to me. Could it happen? Yeah. It could happen.
Solomon, closing words.
Yeah, I think the greatest danger for this American left, and that's the topic of the conversation, is for the Occupy movement and all its variants to be subsumed into the Democratic Party. For the Democrats to somehow occupy the occupiers. That seems to me to be the greatest danger. Why? Because it would, from my point of view, it would mean, again, the eradication of the bad cop. I mean, the way, if you're a traditional establishment figure, is you say, that left, it's coming up again. How do we get them, in control? Well, how do we control them? And I think that this problem is big enough, it's long-standing enough, it's 40 years in the making, maybe longer, but it's the great struggle of our time. And I think that if the Democrats are successful in silencing the bad cop again, then what we'll see is it's going to be worse after 8 years of Republican rule. And so it seems to me that it's really important for the movement to have its own independence and vibrancy. At the same time, I think that this is the dichotomy. I think the Democrats have to be also a piece of this and have to be doing something with it. So I hope that the Democratic Party doesn't follow its instinct and try to destroy the thing that's or let's say to get rid of the wind at its back. Once they all seem to recognize this, they ought to just let it be what it's going to be and not be afraid of Chicago 1968, which they have been for quite some time.
I want to thank you all for coming tonight. If you join me in thanking